My name is Bruce Press. I am a member of the National Capital Area Skeptics who are helping to produce the Skeptics track. I'm also the chair of the Independent Investigations Group of Washington, D.C. We do skeptical investigations and we look into various things like UFOs and ghosts and homeopathy and other craziness. I also am one of the people who run Baltimore Drinking Skeptically. So if you're a Baltimorean, you want to go out on the first Thursday or the second Thursday of the month, have some drinks with other like-minded people, please join us. We meet at Slancha over in Fells Point. There's information here on joining the National Capital Area Skeptics, and I also have some pins and things for you to take away. So I know what we're doing today is going over old hat for all of you. When you were in elementary school, I'm sure you learned about the big UFO invasion of 1952, right? I mean, say when World War II, Korea, the UFO invasion? No?
I think I read about the UFO book during the 70s.
More than likely.
Versus the flying saucers, that war?
Yeah, exactly. In fact, this is, obviously I stole this. This was from a newspaper advertisement for the movie. In fact, there was some confusion brought on by the movie. As part of their advertising campaign, they had somebody go and stand in front of a camera and pretend to be from the United States Air Force and warn people about the invasion of flying saucers, which made things, that much more complicated for people trying to keep this sort of down. So what I'm going to do is we're going to kind of walk through it. We're going to talk about like what the story is, and then try and break it down a little bit. The real issue with this event is that there's a huge amount of information about it. Surprisingly enough, there's a ton of information. I'll go through some of my sources, and I could probably spend the next 6 months going through all the materials and stuff associated with it. So this is going to be really kind of a quick overview. This was, like I said, I'll get into sort of more the context of what this was going on during and stuff as well. And there'll be a little bit of sci-fi silliness thrown in for fun. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of set the context for 1952 for those of you who aren't old enough to have been an adult watching newsreels, so that you get an idea of what 1952 was like. And it's important because what we tend to do is we tend to see things in the past in our own context, and you need to see them in their own context.
At Groton, Connecticut, the huge submarine base sees a new era launched in underseas craft. A crowd of more than 10,000 is assembled for the keel laying of the first atomic-powered submarine.
So yes, this is the beginning of the atomic age.
President Truman approaches the huge cradle in which the sub will be assembled. Many of its parts have been under...
Also things like radar, which figures very prominently in this story, were relatively new. It had only been used commercially for probably 3 or 4 years at that time. It had been used sort of all through World War II by the military, but it hadn't been for commercial aircraft because there wasn't a ton, and people didn't think it was necessary. Not sure why. But as the 50s kind of progressed, this is riots in the Pacific Islands. Another event that I didn't know about or learn about in school.
Throwers and concussion grenades in the cleanup job. As illegal buildings and tents burn fiercely, they mark the finale of one of the toughest...
So anyway, radar became a big deal in the 50s as the commercial air traffic increased, and there was a lot more, and they were more concerned about mid-air collisions and stuff. And the last part of this, I'm just going to jump ahead just a little bit.
Reds in Korea may well have wondered at the pinpoint accuracy with which bombs were hitting their targets. Now, Department of Defense pictures reveal Tarzan, the guided missile being loaded into a B-29 for a test on an isolated bomb range in the United States. Released from an undisclosed altitude, Tarzan starts its long...
Now, we were still in Korea at this point, so, and this is the height of the Cold War, so we were concerned about Russia and China invading our country. There was a certain amount of fear, a certain amount of tension, just in general.
Unerringly, it is held to the sight line, and at all times is under control from the plane. the target and a bullseye.
So just what we're talking about here, for those of you who aren't really familiar with the DC metropolitan area, the players in this are National Airport down here, Andrews Air Force Base. Way up here in Delaware is where they have a military site, both in Dover and I forget where the other air base is. But what's that? No. Yeah. I mean, New Jersey does figure, but it's peripheral. So this is where things are centered, and just below Andrews Air Force Base is where a lot of the sightings were, at least on the radar contacts. So I just want to give you an idea of what we're talking about here. This is a very small area. It's probably only about 50 miles across or something like that. So these things when we start talking about speeds of 600 miles per hour and stuff like that, you can imagine that this is a very small area to cover. This is going to be a quick video, the History Channel. It probably doesn't need any setup. What I'm trying to do is give you an idea of how people talk about this event now. Okay? Because the narrative of this event now in present is very different from what it was at the time.
This epidemic of UFOs has happened before, across the Atlantic. June 1952. Throughout the United States, an alarmingly high number of UFO sightings sweep from coast to coast. The following months come to be known as the Summer of the Saucers. The sightings seem to peak when two Pan Am pilots spot 6 glowing red discs while flying over Newport News, Virginia, on the night of July 14th. But just days later, on July 19th, the wave reaches a breaking point. In the skies over Washington, D.C., air traffic controllers at Washington National Airport track several objects flying over the White House. But the objects vanish before Air Force jets can scramble.
Okay, there are some problems with that. First of all, they didn't track anything over the White House. Second, it was kind of misleading that they showed actual physical flying saucers flying past that aircraft. That was not the case. Nobody saw any physical hard flying saucers. They saw lights in the sky. And if you remember that map I showed you before, the initial sightings of radar blips on that was south of Andrews Air Force Base. So really it was nowhere near DC or the Capitol. So what happened? Is there a big space battle? I don't think so. Nothing happened over the White House. It didn't look like this. Anybody?
Yahoo series.
Nice. Yeah, from Young Einstein, Yahoo series. Sorry, throwing some music. So how do we find out exactly what happened? Where are our sources? Well, we're lucky because newspaper clippings and stuff are all available online now. So we can go back and actually look at what was reported at the time. So that's what I did. I went into the Washington Post archives and looked at what they were saying. Unfortunately, it turns out that there's a lot of credulity in reporting. I know you guys are all probably surprised by that. No, you're not surprised by that? Some of this is obviously hyperbolic. There was the idea of the saucer outrunning the jet we'll talk about a little bit later. Pilots were not ordered to shoot down saucers in range. A lot of this is incorrect information. I like two things about this. One, that they said that they were called whatsits. And in modern terminology, we always use the term UFO. At the time, unidentified aerial phenomena, which I actually kind of like better, was a more common term, or flying saucer, and they would actually report it as flying saucer. But I like two things about this. One, that they called them whatsits, and second, that you had etiquette deodorant cream for 49 cents on a half-price sale. Now, I don't know about you, but I haven't used deodorant cream in a very long time. Okay, so the other source, I don't know how easy this is to see, is the Air Force actually investigated UFOs. There was enough concern after 1947, and no, 1947's concern was not Roswell. Nothing happened at Roswell. But 1947's concern was an incident in Spokane, Washington that spawned this whole rash of flying saucer interest, investigation, along with the Cold War. So they started investigating it in 1947 with Project Sign. Project Sign went from about 1947-48 into 49. And at the time, there was a small amount of resources allocated to the investigation of unknown aerial phenomena. And then in 1949 into 52 was Project Grudge. Now, Project Grudge was interesting in that the tone of their investigation changed. Basically, in Sign, it was an open-minded investigation for a year and a half, trying to find out just what is going on. Is there anything we can find out? And they would actually chase down every report of a flying saucer or a UFO that they could come across. But after a year and a half of not really finding anything, it became somewhat embarrassing to the Air Force. And so the tone during Project Grudge was really just debunk them. Tell me how these can't be flying saucers. The generals didn't want to hear about possible space aliens. It was becoming an embarrassment. And so what they did was they basically tried to bury them as much as possible. And it was kind of unfortunate because while I may or may not believe that there is any possibility of aliens visiting us, I do think that the proper way to investigate things is with an open mind. And that was not what was going on. There was very much political effects influencing how they investigated. And for those of you, I don't know if there are other people who are my age who remember watching Project Blue Book on television. Mm-hmm. Anybody? Yeah. So Project Blue Book started in 1952, and this was during a time when it became basically an epidemic of sightings of flying saucers. And so at this point, there was a little bit of money allocated to it, and there was a much better endeavor to investigate these things as even-handed as possible. And this was still centered on the Air Force, although there were other agencies who did look at UFOs, the CIA, other parts of the Department of Defense, what else I got in there? State, Army, Navy, everybody did issue reports on UFOs. So this is from the Project Blue Book archives, which is available online. So you can go back and look at firsthand investigative reports of these events. So as you saw in the History Channel nonsense, it was building towards an event on the 29th, towards the end of July. And so this is from the 29th, but the report was about the 26th. And this is what part of the report said, that unidentified objects were sighted, and the sightings were both visual and radar, although really only the radar ones had any particular impact, because the visual ones were somewhat weak, and we'll talk about those. So I can read this to you really quick, but what you want to see is that there is a possibility that some of the anomalies were related to atmospheric effects, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But if you look at it, sporadic, intermittent, capable of dropping out of the pattern at will, creeping appearance, and just disappeared from scope. These were not solid trackings of an artifact in the air by radar over a long period of time. They were sporadic. There was maybe 10, then there were 3, then there were 2, then there were 5, and they were appearing sort of randomly below Washington, D.C. So it wasn't like when you see an airplane and that airplane just kind of hits the track and moves along. Okay, just something to remember. And then here's one other excerpt from History Channel.
Many conspiracy theorists suspect the government's next step would be to cover up the visitation. They cite as evidence a reputed sighting that took place over Washington, D.C. in 1952.
In full view of the entire world, a squadron, a formation of UFOs buzzed Washington and fought our own F-93 jet fighters. General Samford willingly and deliberately, maybe on instructions from Harry Truman, who was president, lied to the American people.
We have received and analyzed between 1,000 and 2,000 reports. Of this great mass of reports, we have been able adequately to explain the great bulk of them.
His own Captain Ruppelt, in his own book on flying saucers, says Samford was lying. We have the letter from the Air Force to Dean Condon saying Deep Six UFOs. So, have UFOs come to planet Earth in full view, have manifested themselves, have shown themselves? Yes. Did we see it? Yes. Was there a protocol for handling it? Yes. That protocol was called deny.
That happens to be a really interesting spin on things. One of the editing that they did when General Samford gave that report, because I've watched the full thing, he was actually talking about since 1947 to 1952, they saw between 1 and 2,000, or they investigated between 1 and 2,000 UFO sightings. So it wasn't 2,000 sightings during that weekend in 1952. It was over a 3-year period. Also, that is a very interesting press conference because it's one of the largest ones ever held. There was enough anxiety, enough furor over this that the Air Force had a huge press conference. The president did say that he wanted this dealt with as far as public communications, public panic. The initial reports out of the newspapers were that the Air Force denied everything. Well, in Captain Ruppelt's own notes that are included within the Project Blue Book archive, he said he got a call from the newspapers before he had a chance to investigate anything. And so when they asked him, what does the Air Force have to say about this? He said, the Air Force has nothing to say about this. We haven't looked at anything. So at that time, that was reported as the Air Force denies anything that goes on. And there are other historical accuracies with that. For one, when they talked about the F-93s doing battle with the aliens, that is actually somewhat incorrect for a couple of reasons. Yeah, so this is from UFO, a British sci-fi series. What's interesting about this, and most ridiculous, at least to me, they had one weapon. So when these things, this is an interceptor from UFO. So when they would launch and go after the UFOs, they'd go in a squadron of 3. They would generally shoot all of their missiles. 2 of them would miss and 1 of them would hit. Every time. So that's not an F-93. In fact, it couldn't be an F-93 because the F-93s were never put into production. What actually scrambled were F-94s. So F-94s were an all-weather nighttime interceptor that had onboard radar, and those were scrambled out of Delaware to go and investigate the UFO sightings. And this is important too because it comes into play often is the 640, 600 mile an hour top speed. Because when the pilots reported that they couldn't close with the UFOs, which meant that they saw a light in the sky, they aimed for it, and they never got any closer to it, the assumption by the newspapers is that that object was moving faster than 600 miles an hour. Now, we'll talk about this a little more, but there are other ways to have something in the air that you can see or something on the ground that you can see that you can't get any closer to. No matter how hard you try, you never catch it. So this is from one of the pilots of the F-94s. Basically what he's saying is that there was an area of high moisture and temperature inversion that occurred at, what was it, 1,500 feet? Between 1,200 and 1,500 feet. And he said that the lights were sighted from 5 to 10 miles out, basically at the bottom of that layer. And what happens is those layers of temperature inversion or high moisture content can act like mirrors and reflect objects from farther away or from other distances. So this definitely calls into some of the question, some of the sightings. And certainly this pilot wasn't saying that he was chasing a UFO. He didn't do battle with it. There were no shots fired. Everybody calm down. There was no shots fired. So would you know a flying saucer? I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. And at the end, there's 5 of them. And I'm going to ask you to vote for your favorite picture that is what ufologists consider to be some of the best evidence of flying saucers that they have. So here's one, Washington Monument. It's another one, U.S. Capitol. Another one by the Washington Monument. It's another one, unfortunately, no context. And another one, this has to be the Washington Monument in Baltimore, but it's the other Washington Monument. Okay, so we're going to go back over that. This last one, okay. So we're going to go back over that. So all those in favor of this as the best evidence for UFOs? No? Not impressed? Okay. How about that? Is that what they consider the best evidence? I'm not saying what you think is the best evidence. What do they consider as the best evidence? That one?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah? Yeah? Okay. So that one. That one? Anybody? No? Okay. And that one? No? Okay, so let's go back over them real quick. This picture I took in 2010. If you're careful, you see that there's definitely some artifact replacement here, that it's a reflection in the lens. Which I thought was cool, which is why I kept the picture. I thought that was awesome. That picture actually is one of the ones that they point out as the best evidence of UFOs invading the Earth, or UFOs being spotted in the Earth. This is purportedly from 1952. This is supposedly that same event. The problem is most of these pictures that I could find online do not have their provenance associated with them. So it's very difficult to tell if this is a recreation, if this is the original, or more likely, because it happens an awful lot, if this is a still image captured from one of the History Channel videos that they recreated it. That one, which I love, that's from the day the Earth stood still. So that's not...
That's a documentary, right?
Yes, right. That's Venus, which, again, we're going to talk about how visual artifacts can be mistaken.
It looks like the beginning of This Wonderful Life.
Right. And that one, again, I took probably about 3 months ago, 2 months ago. And so do you believe what you see? We can be fooled very easily. This is a PG talk, but, you know, looks like 3 attractive undressed women on a boat, but really it just has to do with your mind filling in the bits and pieces. So how many people have seen the moon near the horizon and thought it looked huge? Everybody? Does the moon look larger when it's near the horizon? Does the moon actually, is it larger as you perceive it when it's near the horizon? Does anybody believe that atmospheric artifacts or anything?
It looks like it's closer to the ground.
You can see, wow,
That's correct.
I know it's a big building. That moon must be huge.
Right. There's a couple of different, they still don't actually have it nailed down. There's a couple of different theories about why it is that your brain makes it look bigger, but your brain does indeed make it look bigger. So when you look at something, it's always in its context that you can determine its size, its distance, its apparent motion. And in the case of the moon is a great example because we're all very familiar with it. When it is down near the horizon, either your brain says, I understand how far away those trees are, and I know how big the moon is, so it must be, you know, much bigger than those trees, and your brain kind of fixes that. Or it has to do with, you know, how you perceive a vanishing point. There's a whole bunch of different things. But what is interesting is that we've actually known it was an illusion since, like, I don't know, 3,000 years ago. I mean, the ancient Greeks actually knew that it was an illusion because you can basically hold your thumb up and recognize that it's not actually perceived bigger. So yeah, do you perceive things correctly? It's just another reminder that we can be fooled very easily. Has to do with our perspective. So one of the other things about the moon, how many people have driven down the road in the car and it seems like the sun or the moon is following you? right? No matter what you do, it doesn't seem to go away. So that has a lot to do with the distance and perceived distance of the object. So if I'm riding down the road, I have my wife in the car, we go by a tree, tree's pretty close to us, we go a few feet, and that tree moves perceptibly with where we are because it's got a relatively close distance and the angle is changing very fast. But something much farther away, and unfortunately I don't have a graphic for this, like the moon or the sun, is so far away that you don't perceptibly move in relation to it. I mean, certainly we have instruments now that can tell if you've moved, 100 miles, you can see that angle change with the sun. But for the most part in the car, you can't see it. If you're driving down the highway, sun's high in the sky, you look at the shadows on the dashboard, they don't change. And that has to do with the distance. So when you have an observer looking at something and saying it's 10 miles out, or it's 100 miles out, or the problem you have is that, one, you have to know what its size is to start with. And anytime that there's a reflection, you can get easily confused. So that when we talk about the pilots seeing a light that they couldn't close with, and therefore that light had to be moving faster than they are, you're basically, you have to consider that light was a reflection. And as you move closer to the reflection, all that's going to happen is you change the angle of incident and the light goes away because the reflection isn't reflecting back at you anymore. But a light in the sky, whether it's Venus or the moon or a reflection off the bottom of the clouds, as fast as you close with it, you are never going to catch it. Has anybody ever seen the mirage effect on a hot pavement? Do you ever actually run through that puddle on the road? I mean, you don't, because what's happening is the light, the sky reflecting off the pavement doesn't get any closer because you can only have a particular angle where the sky reflects in the heat in the pavement. Obviously, the Air Force, when they did their report, these are the things that they considered. I think I'll probably have some of their write-ups on like what the temperature inversion was and stuff like that. But a lot of times observers don't think of these things. One of the things that I find really interesting, just personally, is the idea of a flying saucer. And why would anybody design a spacecraft that way? So, it is interesting that a lot of those different flying saucers, some of them flew straight, some of them spun. It's just a reasonable explanation of why somebody would travel in a flying saucer, because we don't understand their context or why they would, build a ship that's appropriate for them, right? We put everything in our own context. I do understand that. So one of the things that was significant about this incident is that these objects were seen on radar. It wasn't just a guy in his backyard, like happened last week in Ellicott City, where a guy saw 3 lights in the sky and reported it. These were actually seen on radar. Well, that's pretty good evidence, right? I mean, radar is something that we use all the time to track airplanes, to track weather, to see things in the sky. And the guys who operate radar are highly trained individuals. Or they're assholes. One of the two. Right. So this is what radar looked like in the 1950s. Again, one of the things I want you to do is understand that when we talk about things in 1952, they aren't in our current context. So the digital display of little planes flying along with identifiers on them didn't exist. They didn't have GPS. The introduction of radar to all of the airports in the United States, that system, didn't start occurring until the early 50s and grew obviously through later in the 50s, and certainly by the 70s it was pervasive, but it wasn't at that time. And at the time, this is what radar looked like. This is long-range radar, the kind that you would have at an airport. This is not phased array. Basically, it has a single beam that it's spinning around and bouncing off of things coming back. Later on, they introduced phased array, where they were able to basically steer the beam digitally by having multiple transducers. So what can foul up radar? You can get bounces from ice crystals in the sky. Ground clutter, that means that things on the ground actually reflecting up the radar, bouncing it back. Ducting is when there's an atmospheric channel in the sky between different layers of temperature, where actually you can get the radar to kind of fly through it like a duct, and you'll get reflections back from much, much farther than you expect. You know, the typical landing radar probably has about a 25-mile radius, and then the long-range radar that they use to pick up airplanes coming into their airspace is about 100 miles. But you could get ducting effects that would get you going to 200 miles and seeing artifacts that just aren't in your space, which comes into the echoes beyond working range. Flocks of geese and other animals can upset radar. Various terrain artifacts like mountains and large copses of trees and things like that. And then the atmospheric things we were talking about. And this is kind of what it looks like. If you notice, there's a inversion layer here. There's a big change in temperature causing the radar to bounce back down, and you'd see something that isn't actually where you expect it to be.
Another thing, if they just introduced radar, means the operators couldn't have had all that much experience.
Right. Well, my expectation is, although I don't know this for a fact about the operators of Washington National, but at the time, many of the operators had been in the military and they moved into commercial spaces. So, and also, you had both Washington National Airport and you had Andrews Air Force Base tracking some of these things on radar. And what was interesting, though, is that the description of what they saw at Washington National, the description of what they saw at Andrews, didn't really match up very well. And it's very possible that the reflections that they were seeing, the radar returns that they were seeing, weren't necessarily the same ones. One of the problems that we have is that when you read reports about UFO incidents, and you have one observer here who said he saw things to the west, and an observer over here who possibly farther to the east, he might have seen things to the west as well, but his west could be different. It might not have been the same artifact. And so when Washington National saw some stuff 7 miles south of Andrews, Andrews saw something on their radar that was to the south. We can only assume that they were looking at the same thing, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And then, of course, the observers, the airline pilots, the people on the ground that saw lights in the sky, those lights didn't necessarily have to correlate with what the radar was seeing, because at the time there was no way to do that. We didn't have GPS. The people on the ground, if you're looking to the east, you have one point of reference. So your east could be 5 miles, 10 miles, 100 miles out. And so where that intersects somebody else's view who's maybe a little bit more to the north than you, you don't know that those are the same things. So these are the handwritten notes of the temperature inversion layer. And so this is what was written up in the report. Slight temperature inversion at 800 feet and 4,000 feet altitude. Moisture conditions at these altitudes also appear to be somewhat favorable to anomalous propagation, sometimes referred to as the bending, ducting stuff that we talked about, of the radar electromagnetic wave. This is one of those things that is important for the Air Force. It's important for the radar operators. They can take this as a lesson and learn from it. But when you communicate something like this to the newspapers, it sounds an awful lot like doublespeak. It is not something that's going to impress a reporter. It's not something that you can talk to the public and go, there was a weird atmospheric thing going on that can cause things to be perceived incorrectly, and they just think cover up, deny. None of this is true. So I just want to bring up just a couple of points. The story morphed over time. So it's important to understand that when you read about UFOs, they change very quickly. Even in Captain Ruppelt's book, where he wrote about the incident 20 years later, his story changed from his notes that he took at the time. The newspaper report changed from what was written in the reports that the Air Force had. The stories these people were telling to newspapers were slightly different than what they had told the Air Force. And part of it has to do with celebrity and wanting to tell a good story. When a reporter comes to you and you have really nothing to say, it's kind of uncomfortable. You want to make it sound pretty good. And when Captain Ruppelt wrote his book, he really wanted to sell books. So the story changes over time. History Channel isn't going to get you to watch a show about how a whole bunch of people thought there were UFOs when there was really an atmospheric anomaly that caused, reflections to come back from the radar.
What's that word? Pareidolia or something like that?
Pareidolia.
See things.
Pareidolia, your mind has a tendency to want to create patterns for things. So when you see something that maybe has no pattern or is a pattern that you're unfamiliar with, you tend to force it into known, recognized, or desired patterns. So that's pareidolia. I don't really think that pareidolia played into this too much, although it's possible that because of the hysteria about flying saucers, one of the things I didn't show you is just in that space of time from June and July of 1952, these are the UFO reports that the Air Force was tracking. So there's a significant amount of events going on all over the country. Right near Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Dayton, in July of that same year, there were some anomalous radar contacts that they were concerned with were UFOs in Monmouth, New Jersey, in Washington State near Spokane. So it's very common. There was a lot of it going on. There was hysteria. And that was one of the things that, with the big press conference, the Air Force was trying to contain. Because there's a lot of other stuff going on. The Olympics were coming up. There was the Democratic National Committee convention. It was a busy summer, and they really just didn't want this getting out of hand. So again, the takeaway is the story changes. Not everything is as you perceive it. You need to think critically and think about how other easier stories can fit the apparent evidence. And okay, any questions? Yes.
Yeah, I was called out. Hopefully you didn't show this, but I'm sure I remember seeing on one of these documentaries shots of the radar screens that showed both the UFOs and the jets simultaneously.
Except that there weren't any shots of the radar screens at the time. In fact, one of the things that the Air Force made a big mistake about is on the second night, on July 26th, when these anomalies showed up again after they had appeared the previous night, they actually got the press out of the room. And ostensibly they said that they told the press that it was because there was going to be classified communications and vectoring of the planes and crap like that. And really they just didn't want to share the story with the press. And so there are no pictures, there's no video or anything of the actual radar display from that time.
Interesting. I mean, the Air Force has, of course, their own combat photographers who could have.
Yes.
And they called them in.
Well, again, the thing is that the incident as it was perceived at the time from the Air Force was not a huge deal. It was only because this was a repetitive incident that there were multiple tracks on the radar, or perceived multiple tracks, that they even scrambled the jets. Because that's an expensive proposition, so they don't do that all the time. And again, when those F-94s came down from Delaware, it took them a while because initially they didn't find anything. And it was after 20 minutes of searching that they actually saw a light in the sky, and when the pilot closed with it, it disappeared. And they were really at the end of their fuel at that time and turned around and went back. So there was no initial contact, even though if you go online, you'll find some stories of 4 or 5 solid objects turning around and surrounding the F-94 and then disappearing.
Keep in mind, too, this was a Cold War days. Air Force was constantly scrambling for planes, for unidentified things, for bogies, and so forth. One of the reasons there's probably no great documentation of this was that they took off, found nothing, well, another false alarm, back to the barn.
Actually, there's really good documentation. This event, there's a huge amount of information, and I only scratched the surface of the Project Blue Book reports on it. It goes on for hundreds of pages with atmospheric charts, reports from different players in it. There's actually a significant amount of information.
Yeah, but were they taken was all that documentation made at the time?
Yes.
Or was it done after the fact when it became a big deal?
No,
so everybody went back?
Yeah, it was done at the time. In fact, the weekend before, Captain Ruppelt tried to get to DC to investigate the previous events, but their funding was not such that they could do that. So then the second weekend, when it happened again, and it had already been in the papers, and it became a big deal. So before it became a public issue, actually the generals and the president wanted it investigated. So Captain Ruppelt and part of his team actually were in D.C. at the time and actually went to Washington National to view the radar at the time when these things were actually seen. So these were contemporary to the incident, and they're all available online. Why people like the History Channel don't look at them, I don't know. Last question.
Well, two quick parts. One of them, do you have any idea why people who are science fiction fans tend to be such skeptics? And are people who are ardent believers in this also science fiction fans, or they think science fiction is mocking what they sincerely believe?
That's actually really interesting. I think that people who are science fiction fans spend a lot of time in their youth dreaming about these things, about science and about technological changes and things that we have going on. And as they became real, they became more excited about them. And so I think that lends very well into the science advocacy and the critical thinking that skeptics have. As far as the ufologists and people like that, some of them very much believe that they are viewing things scientifically, that they perceive things as they really are, and so it doesn't really enter into that science fiction stuff like that. I don't think they think it's mocking. I think they recognize that as mythology. And in fact, we had some of our people go to one of the MUFON conferences, the Mutual UFO Network. And they actually have conferences where they train people to hunt UFOs and things like that. And there's a lot of play. There's a lot of people dressing up as aliens and stuff like that. So they have fun with it as well. So I don't think we're too far off of each other as far as how we perceive the world. Well, thank you.